And now, live from Austin, Texas, Alex Jones.
Thank you for joining us for the first live broadcast of 2010, the first live weekday transmission. We kicked it off yesterday with the abbreviated Sunday, 4 to 6 p.m. that I do every Sunday, because we're in a war for Western civilization, a war for liberty and freedom. Private offshore interests, the United Nations and others are openly setting up world government. Lord Christopher Monckton, of course, was the top advisor to Margaret Thatcher. He has an international consulting firm on scientific and corporate issues to governments and Fortune 500. He, of course, is an award-winning journalist in his own right. His bio goes on and on. We'll give you his website several times before he leaves us today. He's with us graciously for the next hour. He, with stunning accuracy, and you know I don't say that for most guests unless it's warranted and due, but I want to single out his accuracy so that people pay particular heed today, with exactly the slogans, exactly the nomenclature, exactly what would happen at Copenhagen, how they would, even if it failed, still have the bureaucracy try to implement it, which Gordon Brown has announced treacherously against the free republics of the world. And so he joins us to talk about what really happened at Copenhagen, what this new system is by the industrialized world, saying they're going to monitor nations' carbon footprint and go ahead and start levying the taxes and doling out Western taxpayer money from Europe, England, and the United States. And then we're going to move into the latest on ClimateGate and how these fraudsters are still trying to take over at the local level. Here in the U.S., taxes on TVs at the state level. In many states, taxes on plastic bags, home inspections. The UN has announced with Schwarzenegger, governors' conferences, mayor conferences, doling out money for cities to implement this, circumventing the federal government, working with foreign powers. This is completely illegal and unconstitutional and is an act of sedition. So we're going to break here in just a few minutes and come back in the long segment. But I want to introduce Lord Christopher Monckton. Sir, great to have you here with us.
Well, Alex, it's a real pleasure once again to be with you. And you're quite right. The usual suspects are still doing their best after the quite spectacular failure of the Copenhagen conference to try and turn it into what in their terms is a success by setting up a so-called high-level panel, which is, if you like, the kind of stub of the world government they had hoped to grow, and they will hope to start transferring your money and mine to that high-level panel, along with the Copenhagen Green Fund. It's actually called the Copenhagen Green Fund. No longer any pretense of political objectivity. We're now in among the Reds who call themselves green, the watermelons, and they are now named as the Green Fund, which is going to be the recipient of all this money that we're going to pay. The United States in particular has said it's going to contribute really enormous sums of money, your money, to this Green Fund. And what it's really going to be used for, of course, is not to help the poorer countries of the world to adapt to climate change, because there's nothing to adapt to. It will be spent instead on setting up and growing the expensive, corrupt, central government bureaucracy of the new, very left-wing, virtually Marxist world government, which the likes of Gordon Brown and Obama and Kevin Rudd in Australia would so very much like to see, and which the countries like China and Russia, of course, who are also inclined in that authoritarian, totalitarian direction, are also inclined to follow. So we haven't won as a result of Copenhagen. We've certainly won on points, but it's not yet a knockout. Much more work is to be done if we are to stop this very sinister movement towards undemocratic world government from carrying on any further. Let us suppose that there was a scientific or economic case
Lord Monckton,
for doing anything about the climate. Yeah.
We've got a break. Come back right there. Sorry to cut you off.
No problem.
Have the third Viscount of Brenchley and Monckton, Lord Christopher Monckton, is our guest. Please stay with us. He'll be right back as he gives us a worldwide briefing on what these criminals are up to. The third Viscount of Monckton and Brenchley, Christopher Monckton, is our guest. If you had to single one person out as the general or the George Washington of this fight against the climate criminals, the scaremongers who know it's a fraud, that want to tax and control all facets of life. It's Lord Christopher Monckton. He is the main champion, the focal point, articulating the facts, predicting the enemy's movements, and giving us the intel to devastate their operations. We've had a major victory at Copenhagen in this engagement, likening it to a naval engagement, but the enemy's main fleet is remassing to launch more attacks, circumnavigating the federal governments of the planet, going directly to the states, the counties, the cities. Schwarzenegger leading that treacherous charge here in the United States. They're also having the bureaucracies of England and the European Union and the United States ignore the people and ignore the UN wanted this treaty, wanted everybody to sign over and sign their rights over to world government and all these new taxes. They couldn't, and so now they're creating the global fund, the green fund, to go buy off government, shut down their development. Maurice Strong and others can suck more money out like they did with the oil for food program. So, sir, breaking down what really happened at Copenhagen, the dragon wounded but not slain yet, and then getting into what their current agenda is and the latest on the ClimateGate investigation, the criminal investigations that have been initiated in different parts of the globe. Sir, you have the floor. Thank you for joining us to brief our listeners.
Well, Alex, I'm going to continue with your military metaphor, and I'm going to take a kind of 3-minute time out, because I'm going to recite to you now an address which was given by Abraham Lincoln in a reedy voice, holding the paper very close to his face, on the battlefield of Gettysburg. This is what he said. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty, and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggled here, have consecrated it far beyond our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living, rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion for that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion, that we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain, that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. Now that's what he said. And that's what I want to talk about now. Because let us suppose that there is a case for doing something about the climate. There isn't, but let's pretend there is. Let's suppose that even if there was a scientific case, there was an economic case. There isn't, but let's pretend that there is. If we're going to have multilateral action, if we're going to have a global government, then honoring what it was that those gallant men at Gettysburg died for, we want to make sure that that government shall be a government of the people, by the people, for the people. It should be an elected government. And I think that what I would like everyone who is listening today to do is to get in touch by telephone with their elected representatives, both in Congress and your senators, both your senators, and say that if we are to go any further whatsoever towards paying taxpayers' money towards this high-level panel or this Copenhagen Green Fund, these first steps towards what would have been a much grander world government unless we'd stopped it at Copenhagen, but it may still come to that. We want to make sure that if there's going to be a world government, it should be an elected world government, elected by the peoples of the world and not appointed by the bureaucrats of the world, as is at present intended. Now, I put it to you, Alex, that is a sensible point. We're saying if there is a problem with the climate, which you and I don't believe there is, if there is an economic solution to it, which you and I don't think there is, if we must have a global government, which you and I don't think we should have, then I'm sure that everybody who is a true American and a follower of Lincoln will admit that that is to be an elected government and not an appointed.